The sky was painted with fire. The war had turned this once thriving colony into a graveyard of metal and ash. Broken ships lay scattered across the battlefield, their burning wreckage casting an eerie glow against the thick smoke that choked the air. The sound of distant explosions echoed, but the real danger was much closer. Daniel Cross moved carefully through the ruins, his pulse steady despite the chaos around him. The war between the Xelka Dominion and the Zyran Resistance had been raging for years, but for Daniel, it was just another battlefield. He was not a soldier of either side, just a scavenger, a mercenary who survived by staying unnoticed. He had seen enough war to know one truth: the only law that mattered was survival. But as he stepped over a collapsed wall, something caught his eye, a movement in the rubble. He tightened his grip on his plasma rifle and moved closer, ready for trouble. A figure lay half buried under debris, her dark armor cracked, her deep violet eyes barely open. She was Zyran, an alien species known for their strong warrior culture. Her breathing was shallow, and her left arm was badly injured. A deep gash ran across her side, and from the way she struggled to lift her head, she had little strength left. Daniel sighed. He should walk away. Helping her meant trouble. The Xelka were hunting down every last Zyran. If they caught him aiding one, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. He turned to leave. Then she spoke. "Please, help." Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but there was something in her tone, something desperate. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, cursing his own instincts. Why should he care? He had spent years looking out for himself, never getting involved in the wars of others. But as he glanced back at her, he saw something different. The Zyran were supposed to be proud warriors, fearless even in death. Yet here she was, asking for help. He let out a slow breath and knelt beside her. "This is a bad idea," he muttered, checking her wounds. She had lost a lot of blood, and her armor had been shattered in places. She wouldn't last much longer without help. The moment his hands touched her side, she flinched. Even in her weakened state, her body tensed like she expected an attack. "I'm not here to hurt you," Daniel said calmly. "But if I don't stop this bleeding, you'll be dead in the next hour." Her violet eyes studied him for a moment before she gave a slow, weak nod. Daniel worked quickly, pulling out a small med-gel pack from his belt. It wasn't much, but it would slow the bleeding. As he applied it to her wound, she hissed in pain, her body trembling slightly. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a guy trying to survive," Daniel replied. "Same as you." She let out a weak, bitter laugh. "You could leave. Safer that way." "Yeah," Daniel said. "I could." And yet he didn't. A sharp whirring sound suddenly filled the air. Xelka patrol drones. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the Zyran woman and pulled her into the shadows of a broken building just as the drones hovered overhead. Their red scanners swept across the battlefield, searching for any survivors. Daniel held his breath. The Zyran woman, despite her pain, didn't make a sound. Her breathing was ragged, but she remained completely still. The drones hovered for a few seconds, then moved on. Daniel exhaled. "That was close," he muttered. She tried to shift her position, but a sharp pain shot through her, making her wince. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, not sure why he even cared. She hesitated, then answered, "Vela." "All right, Vela. Can you walk?" She tried to move again, but shook her head. "Not far." Daniel sighed, glancing at the dark sky. The Xelka would send ground troops soon. They needed to get out of here. He looked at her again. She was exhausted, her body on the edge of giving up. If he left her, she wouldn't last an hour. And yet, helping her meant putting himself in danger. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't know the answer himself. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe he just wasn't ready to watch someone die when he could stop it. Finally, he spoke. I guess I hate seeing people left behind. Then, before she could say another word, he lifted her onto his back and started moving. The war wasn't over. The hunt had just begun. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning metal. Every step Daniel took was careful and measured. Vela lay limp on his back, her breathing shallow, her body weak. She wasn't heavy, but carrying an injured person through a battlefield filled with enemies wasn't easy. They had to move fast. The Xelka were searching for survivors, and if they found him helping a Zyran officer, they would shoot him on sight. Vela stirred slightly. "You should leave me," she whispered. Daniel ignored her. "And let you die. Not happening." She let out a weak breath, almost like a laugh. Foolish human. Daniel didn't answer. He focused on the ruined streets ahead. The war had left the city in ruins, collapsed buildings, wrecked vehicles, and the occasional scattered body of those who hadn't been lucky enough to escape. Every corner was a risk. He spotted an old warehouse ahead. It looked damaged, but the walls were still standing. A temporary hiding place. "Almost there," he muttered. But just as he stepped forward, a metallic whirring sound filled the air. Drones. Daniel quickly ducked behind a broken wall, pressing his back against it. His heart pounded as he peeked around the corner. 3 Xelka patrol drones floated just above the street, scanning the area. Their red lights moved over the debris, searching for movement. Vela barely lifted her head. "They will find us." "Not if we stay quiet," Daniel whispered. He held his breath. One of the drones hovered dangerously close. Its scanner flickered, moving toward the very spot they were hiding. Daniel's fingers tightened on his rifle. If it got too close, he'd have to take it down fast. The drone paused. Then, a sudden explosion in the distance shook the ground. The drones turned sharply and flew toward the sound. Daniel exhaled. Lucky break. He adjusted his grip on Vela and hurried toward the warehouse. Inside the warehouse. The inside of the warehouse was dark and filled with broken crates and rusted machinery. Daniel gently lowered Vela onto the floor. She winced as he did, her wounds clearly causing her pain. "You still alive?" he asked. "Barely," she muttered. Daniel pulled out another med gel pack and opened it. "This will help with the pain." She hesitated before nodding. "Do it." He pressed the gel against her wound. Vela hissed, her body tensing, but she didn't scream. Tough. Daniel respected that. As he worked, she studied him with those deep violet eyes. "You fight like a soldier," she said, "but you are not with any army." "I fight to survive," Daniel replied simply. Vela smirked. "Mercenary." "Scavenger," he corrected. "War zones are full of things people leave behind." Her smirk faded, like the dying. Daniel didn't answer. A deadly discovery. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel heard something. Footsteps. His body went rigid. Not drones. This was something else. He grabbed his rifle and peeked through a crack in the warehouse wall. Xelka patrol squad. 3 soldiers, heavily armed. They were scanning the area, their reptilian forms moving with trained precision. "Looks like they're sweeping the area," Daniel muttered. Vela tried to move, but her body was too weak. "You should run." Daniel rolled his eyes. "You keep saying that. Not gonna happen." She stared at him, confused. "You risk your life for nothing." He smirked. "Maybe, but you still owe me answers, so try not to die." Vela gave a small laugh, weak, but genuine. Daniel checked his ammo. Not much left. If they found them, he'd have to be smart. The soldiers moved closer. One of them stopped. Daniel held his breath. The Xelka warrior sniffed the air, his yellow eyes narrowing. He sensed something. Daniel gripped his rifle tighter. Then, a loud crash from another part of the city made the warriors turn. "Go check it out," one of them ordered. The patrol moved away. Daniel exhaled. That was close. Vela looked at him. You are lucky. No, Daniel said. I just know when to wait. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I see why humans are dangerous. Daniel smirked. We do our best. Vela shifted, trying to sit up. We can't stay here. They will come back. Daniel nodded. We need a real escape plan. Vela hesitated, then spoke. I know a way. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Oh. She winced as she moved. A ship, hidden before the attack. Daniel's mind raced. The ship. If she was telling the truth, that could be their way out. Where? He asked. 3 miles from here, she said. But it won't be easy. Daniel chuckled. Nothing ever is. He stood, checking his rifle one last time. All right, Vela, he said. Let's go steal a ship. The night sky was filled with distant explosions, flickering like dying stars. The battlefield was quiet for now, but Daniel knew it wouldn't last. The Selka never left survivors alone for long. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and glanced at Vela. She was leaning against the warehouse wall, breathing heavily. She was strong, but she wouldn't last much longer without real medical care. We need to move, Daniel said. That ship of yours, where is it exactly? Vela took a deep breath, trying to gather her strength. An old Zarin outpost, 3 miles from here, hidden in the underground hangar. Daniel frowned. 3 miles. You're barely standing. She smirked, despite her pain. That's why. You're carrying me. Daniel rolled his eyes. Great, because I love carrying injured aliens through war zones. Vela chuckled but winced as pain shot through her side. Daniel sighed. He couldn't leave her behind. Not now. All right, he said. Let's go before the Xelka start checking this place. He helped her up, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. She tensed at first, then leaned on him, accepting the support. You smell like fire and metal, she muttered. Daniel smirked. Yeah. Well, you smell like someone who lost a fight. She let out a weak laugh. Through the ruins. They moved carefully through the ruins of the city. The roads were cracked, covered in debris. Fires still burned in the distance, sending shadows dancing across the shattered buildings. Every few minutes, they had to stop. Vela was breathing hard, trying to fight through the pain, but Daniel could feel her getting weaker. How much further? He whispered. She pointed ahead, past those buildings. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He didn't like this. Too open, too exposed. Then he heard it. Heavy footsteps. Not drones this time. Soldiers. Daniel cursed under his breath and pulled Vela into the remains of an old transport vehicle. Through a shattered window, he saw them. 5 Selka warriors, fully armored, scanning the area. They're searching for something, Vela whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw. Yeah, us. One of the soldiers barked an order in their guttural language. The group split up, moving through the ruins. We can't stay here, Vela said. If they find us. They won't, Daniel interrupted. But we have to be smart. Vela nodded. I can distract them. Daniel looked at her like she was insane. You can barely walk. What are you gonna do? Insult them until they leave. Vela smirked. It works on you. Daniel shook his head. Stay low. I'll handle this. She watched as he pulled a small shock grenade from his belt. It was weak, wouldn't kill them, but it would buy time. Daniel took a deep breath. Then, with a quick motion, he tossed the grenade into the street. Boom! A bright blue flash lit up the ruins, sending electric arcs through the air. The Xelka shouted in confusion, their suits sparking. Daniel didn't wait. He grabbed Vela's arm. Run. They sprinted, or rather, Daniel ran while half-carrying Vela. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself forward. The Xelka recovered quickly. One of them spotted them. There. Stop them. Gunfire erupted behind them. Daniel cursed and dove behind a collapsed wall, dragging Vela with him. "We won't make it," she panted. "Not like this." Daniel scanned the area. They needed a distraction. His eyes landed on an old, half-destroyed power station nearby. If he could overload it. He turned to Vela. "Can you still fire a weapon?" She gave him a tired but determined look. "Always." He handed her his sidearm. "Cover me." Without waiting for an answer, he sprinted toward the power station. The explosion. The Excelka saw him and opened fire. Plasma rounds scorched the air around him. Daniel ducked behind a metal pillar, breathing hard. Vela, despite her injury, lifted the sidearm and fired precise shots, forcing the soldiers to take cover. Daniel reached the station's control panel. It was barely functional, but he didn't need much. He ripped out a few cables and crossed the wires. Sparks flew. "Come on, just a little more." The system beeped. "Overload in 5, 4, 3. Daniel ran. "Vela, move." She didn't argue. She fired a few more shots, then limped toward him as fast as she could. Boom. The explosion ripped through the area, sending metal and debris flying. The Selka were thrown back by the shockwave. Daniel and Vela barely made it behind cover before the flames roared past them. Silence followed. Daniel groaned, rubbing his head. "I really hope that was worth it." Vela looked back at the destruction. It was. Daniel helped her up again. "Let's go before they get back up." The outpost. They finally reached the entrance of the Zyran outpost, a hidden tunnel covered by rubble. Vela activated a small device on her wrist. The rubble shifted, revealing a metallic door. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Fancy." Vela smirked. "Zyran technology is reliable." They stepped inside. The air was cold, but safe. Daniel exhaled in relief. Vela leaned against the wall, her body shaking from exhaustion. "You didn't have to save me back there." Daniel shrugged. "Yeah, well, I don't like leaving people behind." She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "You are different from the others," she said. Daniel smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Vela closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "Get some rest," Daniel said. "We're not out of this yet." And for the first time since the war began, she felt like she wasn't alone. Daniel sat against the cold metal wall of the Zyran outpost, his breathing still heavy from their escape. His body ached, and his muscles burned from carrying Vela most of the way. But they had made it. Vela leaned back, exhausted. Her wounds were still bad, but the underground hideout provided them a brief moment of safety. The walls were lined with Zyran technology. Dim blue lights flickered, and a control panel hummed softly. The place had power, but for how long? Daniel took a sip from his water canteen and offered it to Vela. She hesitated, then accepted it, taking a few slow sips before handing it back. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice hoarse. "The Xelco will track us." Daniel smirked. "You just got here, and you already want to leave." Vela gave him a tired look. "They have patrols, drones, even scent trackers. They will find us soon." Daniel frowned. She was right. The Xelka weren't the type to give up on a target. If they had already sent ground troops, that meant they were serious about wiping out every last Zyran survivor. He glanced at the control panel. "This place, does it have weapons? Defenses?" Vela shook her head. No, it was just a small supply outpost. Nothing to fight with. Daniel sighed. "Great, so we're sitting ducks." Vela tried to move, but winced in pain. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. "Hey, take it easy," Daniel said, moving to help her. She waved him off. "I'm fine." He raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, you don't look fine." Vela smirked. "And you don't look smart. But here we are." Daniel chuckled. "All right, fair." But before he could say anything else, a sharp beeping sound filled the room. Vela turned to the control panel. Her eyes widened. They found us. The Excelka arrive. Outside, the sky was dark, and the ruins of the city stretched endlessly. The Excelka patrol moved like shadows, their armored boots crunching against the rubble. Their orders were clear: find the human and the Zarin. No survivors. One of the Excelka warriors, a high-ranking officer, scanned the area with a small device. They are close, he growled in his deep reptilian voice. Another soldier stepped forward. We will flush them out. The officer nodded and signaled his team. A group of 10 heavily armed Selka soldiers moved toward the hidden entrance of the outpost. Inside, Daniel and Vela watched the security screen. The blurry images showed Selka soldiers surrounding the area. Daniel clenched his jaw. Well, this is bad. Vela pressed a few buttons on the console. They haven't found the entrance yet, but they will. Daniel grabbed his rifle. We need an exit plan. Fast. Vela turned to him. There's a tunnel. Leads to an old transport pad. But, Daniel sighed. Let me guess. It's not working. Vela nodded. It needs power, and we don't have time. Daniel rubbed his temples. They were trapped. Then an idea hit him. What if we make them think we're escaping another way? Vela frowned. Explain. Daniel smirked. We trigger an explosion on the far side of the outpost. Make it look like we're breaking through the walls. They'll rush there while we slip out the tunnel. Vela hesitated. That could work, but how do we trigger the explosion? Daniel grinned. You got anything flammable in this place? Vela gestured to a storage crate. Old fuel cells. Daniel's smirk widened. Perfect. The decoy plan. Working fast, Daniel set up a makeshift explosive using the fuel cells and a broken power circuit. He placed them near a cracked section of the wall, making sure the blast would send debris outward. Vela watched him work. You've done this before. Daniel shrugged. Let's just say I've had to improvise a lot. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. I believe it. Once the setup was done, Daniel looked at her. You sure you can move? Vela took a deep breath. I'll manage. He handed her a small detonator. Once we're in the tunnel, press this. Vela held it tightly. Let's go. The escape moving quickly, they entered the hidden tunnel, a narrow passageway that led beneath the ruins. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with broken cables. Above them, the Tselka moved closer to the outpost entrance. Then, Vela pressed the detonator. Boom! A massive explosion shook the ground. Fire and smoke erupted from the far side of the outpost. The Tselka warriors immediately turned toward the blast. They're breaking through the wall. One of them shouted, Go! Capture them! The officer barked. The soldiers rushed toward the smoke, leaving the entrance unguarded. Below, Daniel and Vela moved as fast as they could. We did it, Daniel whispered. Vela nodded, breathing heavily. Not yet. The transport pad. We still have to activate it. Daniel sighed. Of course, because nothing is ever easy. The final stretch. At the end of the tunnel, they reached the old transport pad. It was covered in dust and flickering weakly. Vela hurried to the controls, her fingers tapping quickly. I can start it, but it needs time to warm up. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Above them, the Tselka realized they had been tricked. The explosion was a decoy. They're still inside. Find them. Daniel took a deep breath and positioned himself near the tunnel entrance. Vela glanced at him. You're going to fight them. Daniel smirked. I just need to buy you a little time. Vela hesitated. You could run. Leave me here. Daniel rolled his eyes. And let you take all the credit. No way. Vela stared at him for a long moment. Then, despite everything, she smiled. You're a strange human, Daniel Cross. Daniel grinned. Yeah, I get that a lot. As the transport pad powered up, the sound of Selka soldiers charging toward them filled the tunnel. The final battle was about to begin. The underground tunnel trembled as footsteps echoed through the stone walls. The Selka were coming. Daniel Cross gripped his rifle, his eyes fixed on the dark passageway ahead. Behind him, Vela frantically worked at the control panel of the transport pad. "It needs more time to charge," she said, her voice tense. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the tunnel. "How much time?" 2 minutes. Daniel exhaled sharply. That was too long. The Selka soldiers were fast. They had already realized the explosion was a decoy, and now they were coming. 10, maybe more. Daniel could already hear their weapons powering up. Vela looked at him. "Go. I can finish this." Daniel smirked. "Not a chance." He pressed his back against the wall, adjusting his grip on his rifle. He had fought mercenaries, smugglers, even rogue cyborgs before, but fighting Selka warriors in a narrow tunnel was suicide. Still, he had no choice. "You trust me?" he asked. Vela hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded. "Yes." Daniel smirked. "Good. Then keep working. I'll handle the rest." Vela turned back to the console, her hands moving fast. The transport pad's power levels were rising. Daniel knelt, took a deep breath, and aimed his rifle. The first Selka appeared. The first attack. A tall, armored Selka warrior stepped into the tunnel, his reptilian eyes glowing in the dim light. He spotted Daniel immediately and raised his plasma rifle. Daniel fired first. The energy blast struck the Selka's shoulder, making the alien stumble back. But it wasn't enough to bring him down. The Selka were tough. The warrior snarled and fired back. Daniel barely rolled away in time. The plasma shot burned into the wall, sending sparks flying. More soldiers poured in behind the first. Daniel cursed. Too many. He reached into his belt and grabbed a flash charge. With a quick motion, he threw it down the tunnel. Boom! A bright white light exploded, blinding the Selka for a few seconds. Daniel used the moment to fire again. His shots hit 2 warriors, forcing them to take cover. Behind him, Vela shouted, "Almost ready." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Hurry up. A close call." The Selka recovered quickly. One of them rushed Daniel, moving fast despite his heavy armor. Daniel barely managed to block the incoming strike with his rifle. The force of the attack sent him crashing against the wall. The Selka grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground. Daniel struggled, gasping for air as the alien tightened his grip. Then, suddenly, a gunshot. The Selka warrior stiffened, his grip loosening. A plasma shot burned through his side. Daniel fell to the ground, coughing. He turned his head. Vela stood behind him, holding his sidearm, smoke rising from the barrel. Daniel grinned. "Nice shot." Vela smirked. "Told you I could shoot." She tossed him back his gun, and he caught it. Then she pointed at the transport pad. "It's ready." The final sprint. The Selka soldiers weren't stopping. Even as Daniel and Vela ran to the platform, more were pushing into the tunnel. Daniel covered Vela as she sprinted to the pad. She tapped a few buttons, activating the controls. The platform began to glow. Daniel turned and fired again, forcing the Selka to slow down. But one of the warriors threw an explosive device. Daniel's eyes widened. "Move." The grenade hit the ground just as Daniel dove onto the platform. Boom! The blast sent shockwaves through the tunnel. Dust and fire roared toward them. Vela slammed the activation button. The transport pad hummed, and then, in a flash of light, they were gone. Crash landing. The world spun. For a moment, Daniel felt weightless, his vision blurred, his body twisted. Then suddenly, gravity pulled him down. He crashed hard onto a metal surface. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Vela landed beside him, groaning. Daniel coughed and looked around. They were no longer in the tunnel. Instead, they were in a dark hangar, massive, abandoned, and silent. Vela pushed herself up. "We made it." Daniel winced. "Barely." He glanced behind them. The transport pad fizzled and sparked, damaged from the explosion. Vela sighed. No going back now. Daniel sat up, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Yeah, well, where exactly are we?" Vela looked around, then pointed. There, at the far end of the hangar, was a Zyran starship. Daniel's eyes widened. "Is that?" Vela nodded. "Our way out." Daniel let out a tired laugh. Finally, some good news. But before they could celebrate, a sound echoed through the hangar. Daniel's smile faded. He grabbed his rifle. "We're not alone." Vela's eyes darkened. "Zelka." Daniel shook his head. "No, something else." They both turned toward the shadows, where something big was moving. And whatever it was, it had just noticed them. The air inside the abandoned hangar was cold and still. Dust floated in the dim blue light from the overhead panels, flickering weakly after years of neglect. Daniel Cross tightened his grip on his rifle, his muscles tense. Something was moving in the shadows. Vela, still recovering from her injuries, took a slow step forward, her sharp violet eyes scanning the darkness. "Selka," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "No, something else." A low growl echoed through the chamber. The sound was deep and unnatural, sending chills down Daniel's spine. Then, two glowing eyes appeared in the dark. They were huge, burning like molten metal, locked directly on them. Vela tensed. "That's not friendly." Daniel smirked. "Didn't think it was." Then the creature lunged. A monster in the dark. The thing moved fast, too fast. A massive blur of dark scales and metal plating. Its four powerful legs smashed against the ground, sending shockwaves through the hangar. Daniel barely rolled away in time as razor-sharp claws slashed the air where he had been standing. Vela fired first. Her plasma shot hit the creature's armored hide, but barely left a mark. Daniel cursed. Of course, it's bulletproof. The beast turned its attention to Vela and charged. Daniel didn't think, he just acted. He sprinted forward and slammed his rifle against the creature's face, knocking it off course just before it could reach her. It roared in frustration and swung its tail. The impact sent Daniel flying, crashing into a stack of metal crates. His vision blurred for a second, but he forced himself up. No time to feel pain. Vela shouted, "Daniel, move." He saw it too late. The creature's massive jaws were coming right at him. But at the last second, Vela activated a nearby crane, dropping a heavy cargo container between Daniel and the monster. Crash. The beast smashed into the crate, momentarily dazed. Daniel grinned. "Nice save." Vela smirked. "Try not to die, human." The creature snapped its head toward them. Enraged, it wasn't giving up. Daniel turned to Vela. "We need to go. Now." She nodded and pointed. The ship. At the far end of the hangar, the Zyran starship sat in the shadows. It was a sleek black and silver craft, its engines dark but intact. If they could get inside, they could escape. Reaching the ship, Daniel grabbed Vela's arm, pulling her toward the ship. The creature roared and charged again. The ground trembled as it chased them, its massive body smashing through crates and broken machinery. Daniel fired over his shoulder, aiming for its eyes. The beast snarled as a shot grazed its face, but it only made it angrier. Vela limped beside him, moving as fast as she could despite her injuries. "Almost there," Daniel shouted. The ship's entrance was locked, but Vela slammed her wrist console against the panel. The door beeped, then hissed open. Daniel pushed her inside first, then turned just as the creature leaped toward him. He dived forward, rolling inside the ship as the door slammed shut behind him. A massive thud shook the ship as the creature smashed against the hull. Daniel lay on the floor, panting. That was close. Vela, also breathing hard, managed a small smirk. You always take this many risks. Daniel grinned. Only on bad days. Another theory. The creature wasn't giving up. It was trying to tear through the hull. Vela quickly moved to the cockpit. We need to take off before it rips the ship apart. Daniel scrambled to his feet and followed her. Please tell me you know how to fly this thing. Vela's fingers moved swiftly across the controls. The ship hummed to life, its systems flickering on. She smirked. I was a Zyran pilot before the war. I know how to fly. Good, Daniel said, because I don't. Taking off. The ship shook violently as the engines powered up. Outside, the beast howled in frustration, clawing at the hull. Vela activated the thrusters. The ship lifted off the ground. The creature let out a final deafening roar as the ship shot through the hangar doors, breaking into the open sky. Daniel exhaled in relief as the ruined city shrank below them. Vela checked the scanners. We're clear, for now. Daniel slumped into the co-pilot seat, running a hand through his hair. That was insane. Vela smirked. Welcome to my life. Daniel chuckled. You're not the only one. The chase continues. Just as they thought they were safe, the ship's alarm blared. Daniel sat up. What now? Vela's expression darkened. Zelka ships, they're coming. Daniel looked at the scanner. 3 Zelka fighters were closing in fast. He sighed. Of course they are. Vela gripped the controls. I hope you're good at shooting. Daniel smirked. I learned fast. He strapped himself into the gunner seat. The Zelka ships opened fire. Daniel gritted his teeth and fired back. The real battle had just begun. The ship jerked as another plasma blast hit its shields. The alarm blared, flashing red across the cockpit. Hold on, Vela shouted. Daniel gripped the sides of his seat, his heart pounding. He could feel the ship rocking with each hit, but the Zyran vessel's shields held strong. Can you shake them off? Daniel asked, watching the 3 Zelka fighters that were now locked onto them, relentlessly pursuing. Vela's hands moved quickly across the controls. Trying. She pressed a few buttons, and the ship's speed increased, its engines roaring as they shot forward, dodging another wave of plasma fire. Daniel scanned the fighters on the radar. They're getting closer. We need to fight back, or they'll catch us. Vela gritted her teeth. I know. Hold on. The ship veered to the left, then right, darting through the sky at impossible speeds. The Zelka ships were fast, but they weren't as agile as this Zyran vessel. Still, they were relentless. Daniel pulled the controls toward him. He'd only used ship weapons a few times before, but he didn't have much of a choice now. He pressed a button, and the ship's turrets locked on to the nearest enemy fighter. Here we go, Daniel muttered. He squeezed the trigger. The energy beams shot out, striking the Zelka fighter's engines. It burst into flames, spiraling out of control before crashing to the ground below. Vela smiled briefly. Nice shot. Thanks, Daniel replied, glancing at the remaining 2 fighters. One of them shot at them again, narrowly missing the ship's hull. Vela twisted the controls, taking the ship into a sharp dive, the craft plummeting toward the ground before pulling up at the last second. We're playing with fire here, Daniel said, gripping his seat harder as the ship shot upward again. Vela didn't reply, her focus on the chase. Daniel checked the radar again. They're closing in again. We need to do something quick. Vela's eyes flashed. I have an idea. Hold on. She hit a few buttons on the console, and the ship suddenly went dark. The cockpit lights blinked out, leaving them in near darkness. Daniel frowned, looking at her. Did you just turn off the power? He asked, his voice unsure. Trust me, Vela said, her voice calm but determined. I'm rerouting the power to the thrusters. It'll give us a burst of speed, but it'll be short-lived. We can only use it once. Are you sure this will work? Daniel asked, looking out at the approaching fighters. Unsure, Vela replied, "Just be ready." As soon as the fighters came within range, Vela slammed the button for the emergency power surge. The ship shot forward like a rocket, its speed more than doubling for a few seconds. The Xelka pilots were caught off guard as the ship slipped through their formations, leaving them behind in a blur. Daniel couldn't help but grin. "That's what I'm talking about." Vela's grin matched his, but she quickly sobered. "We don't have much time. The burst won't last long, and once the Xelka realize what happened, they'll come after us again." "Then we make this count," Daniel said. "Let's finish this." The final push. They had gained some distance from the fighters, but the Xelka weren't about to give up. Soon, the remaining two ships were on their tail again, weapons powered up. "Hold tight," Vela warned as she sharply turned the ship to the left, suddenly banking to avoid the incoming fire. The plasma beams barely missed them, but one of the shots struck the wing, sending a shockwave through the ship. "Damn it," Vela shouted, struggling to maintain control. "Can you still fly?" Daniel asked, his voice tense. "I'm fine," Vela replied through gritted teeth. "Just need tow." Before she could finish, the remaining Xelka fighters opened fire again. This time, Daniel's instincts kicked in. He quickly grabbed the side turret controls, locking the targeting system onto one of the fighters. "I've got this," he shouted, squeezing the trigger. Energy blasts flew through the air, hitting the fighter square in the engine compartment. The ship exploded in a flash of blue light, the pieces scattering in the wind. "Yes," Daniel shouted, relief flooding through him. Vela's hands flew over the controls. "One more." Daniel barely had time to react before the last Xelka fighter fired one last barrage of shots. This time, the ship's shields barely held, and the ship jolted, sending Daniel flying into the dashboard. His head spun. "We need to end this now." "I'm on it," Vela shouted, locking onto the final ship. The Xelka fighter tried to evade them, but Vela was faster. She locked the targeting system onto the fighter's weak spot, its engines, and fired. The last Xelka ship exploded in a blinding flash of light, its pieces scattering into the air. Daniel grinned as the silence settled. The final fighter had been destroyed. Vela let out a long breath. That was too close. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "No kidding." They both sat in silence for a moment, looking out at the now empty sky. The battle was over. Vela turned to Daniel, her expression softening. "You're not like the others." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She gave him a small smile. "You actually care. I thought humans were all about themselves." Daniel shrugged. "I've had my share of selfish days, but you kind of grow out of it when you have someone depending on you." Vela studied him for a moment, her violet eyes searching. Then she nodded slowly. "I think I owe you more than just my life." Daniel smirked. "I'm happy with the life part for now, but we'll figure the rest out later." He turned back toward the control panel. The sky stretched out before them, wide and empty. They were free for now. But Daniel knew one thing was certain. This was only the beginning.